Hello again, and welcome to YouTube lecture number 2 on period 7, 1890 to 1945. This one introduces the concept of progressivism. Now, actually, in your concepts, progressivism would come first, as I'm flipping through my pages right now. But I started with imperialism because, as I mentioned in the other video, I like chronological order. I like things going in the way they actually go about. And in a lot of respects, progressivism and imperialism and all the various themes we're going to talk about in this key concept all kind of fall under this umbrella of progressivism. And that's why we keep this same focus question. In what ways did progressivism include both democratic and anti-democratic aspects? So here we're going to talk specifically about progressivism. Now in the last one, it was just imperialism, but there was still progressivism thought there in the other videos that come as well, especially when we get to FDR and the New Deal. But let's stick here. Let's start here with 7.1, Roman numeral 2. All right, so we're skipping Roman numeral 1 for now because we're going to use that for the Great Depression. So we'll go here in number 2. This progressive era of the early 20th century. But again, as a way of review for you, period 6 was more about the rise of industrialism and the Gilded Age. But in class, I had mentioned to you, progressive reformers were already coming. Jane Addams, for instance. She's mentioned by name, but in period 6. But she is a precursor, or basically a founder of this movement known as progressivism. Jacob Riis, who I mentioned in period 6 as well, has How the Other Half Lived, 1890, right? Also on the verge of progressivism. So a lot of progressivism began during the Industrial Age, but it explodes right at the turn of the century, right? They're responding to political corruption, economic instability, and the social concerns of the day. And what progressives wanted was, and it's right here in the concept, greater government action, right? And other political and social measures. Here now you have a group of individuals that are going to be in both the Republican and the Democratic Party who are going to feel like government needs to be a little bit more responsive and responsible for the American people. In letter A, you're introduced to these journalists, these progressive era journalists, known as muckrakers, by the way. Here's the word right down here, muckrakers. I'll tell you in a moment how they got that name, but I want to point out again here, what are they doing? Well, they look at political corruption. They're looking at what's called social injustice, economic inequality, right? And they begin to expose it. Newspapers and especially magazines of the time. A lot of very popular magazines these muckrakers will write for. They'll look at the tenement homes, for instance, like Jacob Riis' How the Other Half Lived, right? But others will write specific articles about the corruption that takes place in a tenement home against immigrants. They'll look at corruption that's happening within the United States Senate. They'll look at economic inequality between those who have and those who do not have, right? The top 1%. Right, who seem to control too much of the world's wealth. They'll begin to expose a lot of this. Right? Now, it's a movement that's mostly from the middle class. It's mostly a middle class movement, but the concept does say from middle and upper class, because Theodore Roosevelt will get involved in this, and he's definitely upper class. A lot of women, right? Women are always the backbone of any social movement and real effective change in America. Don't ever forget that. You go back to the Second Great Awakening, right? And it was women who led most of those charges for abolitionists, temperance movements. Of course, they begin their suffrage movement, education reform, prison and asylum reform. You go back even before that to the First Great Awakening. There was many women were involved in that. So throughout our history, we see when it comes to social change, real effective change in America, women are the backbone of that. They want to, like I said, affect social changes in the cities and for the immigrant population. So that would tie back into period 6 and Jane Addams and her settlement home, right? We went from putting immigrants in these tenement homes to creating settlement homes, helping an immigrant to settle and become more Americanized if they choose. Now maybe you want to put in your note, what was the name of Jane Addams' settlement house? I'm not going to tell you. Again, look back at your other notes, and maybe in this note, you might want to write that down. So the Muckrakers, well, they got their name actually from Theodore Roosevelt. He called them Muckrakers, and it wasn't because of necessarily a good thing. See, it comes from a very famous book known as The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come. Right? The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come. This was a publication that was written in the year 1678. I'll tell you that year again, 1678. So during colonial periods, right, in America, that's the height of colonialism. To put that in perspective, in 1676 was Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. Right? So you get Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. You've got the King Phillips War is taking place in New England. All right? So those things are taking place when this particular publication is written. The Pilgrim's Progress from This World to That Which Is to Come. And in Pilgrim's Progress, and Theodore Roosevelt gives a speech in April of 1906 where he alludes to this. And I just want to read this one part to you. And this is Theodore's speech. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, you may recall the description of the man with the muckrake, the man who could look no way but downward, with the muckrake in his hand, who was offered a celestial crown for his muckrake, but who could neither look up nor regard the crown he was offered, but continued to rake to himself the filth of the floor. In Pilgrim's Progress, the man with the muckrake is set forth as the example of him whose vision is fixed on carnal instead of spiritual things. Yet he also typifies the man who in this life consistently refuses to see aught that is lofty and fixes his eyes with solemn intentness only on that which is vile and debasing. Now you're probably sitting here right now and you're going, huh? Am I supposed to write that down? No one has to write that down. But I'm going to give you part of this quote later in class. In other words, so you have a man with a muckrake. Muck is something you usually find at the bottom of like a lake, right? It's the filth, it's that scummy feeling. If you've ever walked into a lake and it feels slippery, well, there's your muck, there's your filth. This man with the muckrake is trying to clean things up. And basically heaven came to offer him a celestial crown, or basically allowing him to come to heaven. But he's so intent on cleaning the filth that he could not look upon that which was good or holy. So what Roosevelt is arguing in essence here is that muckrakers only focus on bad. Why don't they ever see what's going on that is positive or good? But Theodore Roosevelt himself basically is in essence a muckraker to some degrees. He also will attack, right? He will attack what he calls the malefactors of business, right? The men who have taken control to what is hurtful to the consumer, right? So in a lot of respects, he also becomes a muckraker, but he also focused a lot on what he thought was good about America, which is, again, one of those things that's very contradicting about Theodore Roosevelt. But muckrakers served a purpose. Ida Tarbell, and I love that name because her middle initial starts with an M, so if you think of this, you can say, I am Tarbell, right, would be her initials. Now, she is one of the leading muckrakers, a female investigative reporter, and I just want you to look her up in your notes. I want you to tell me, what was Ida Tarbell famous for? And again, she's one of the leaders of this group, the Muckrakers, and becomes very influential herself in going after a particular titan of industry, if you will, and help to expose much of the corruption that he was part of. So that's one of the things I want to see in your notes, when you turn in your notes. Who was Ida Tarbell, and what did she do? I also want to introduce you to David G. Phillips, another muckraker. He wrote a series of articles known as The Treason of the Senate, 1906. So this is right around the time that Theodore Roosevelt gave his muckrake speech, because he attacked the Senate. And here's a quote from here. "The Senate is in fact the final arbiter of the sharing of prosperity. The laws it permits or compels, the laws it refuses to permit, the interpretation of laws it permits to be appointed, these factors determine whether the great forces which modern consecration has produced shall operate to distribute prosperity equally or with shameful inequality and cruel destructive injustice." You have to understand some things here. Again, try to remember some stuff. Senators at this time period are not elected by the people. Senators at this time period are appointed by the state. Think back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those two men debated in 1858 so that the state could decide who would best serve Illinois in the Senate. Nobody voted for them. And Lincoln lost those debates to Stephen Douglas, but became famous. Now we're so many years past, and you might remember political bosses and political machines and how they also got in bed with big business. This is a famous political cartoon. I tell you what, it's time to take a drink. I'm going to stop. I'm going to have a nice, cool, delicious beverage right now. I have a little iced tea with me. Hopefully you have something now. You could have paused at this moment. There. All right. I feel better. Awesome. This is entitled The Bosses of the Senate. Right. So who are the bosses of the Senate? Well, not only political bosses, but the monopolies, right? Steel Beam Trust, Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust. So steel, there's Carnegie. Standard Oil is Rockefeller, right? You've got all these. There's a sugar trust, a tin trust, a coal, right? I know you can't read this, but it says, this is a Senate of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. Think for a minute. What does that remind you of? That is a play on words of a very famous speech. Of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. I'm going to want you to put that in your notes. What is that a play on words of? What is this cartoonist trying to tell us that one guy several decades earlier tried to bring about a democratic change for the better, and here we are decades later and we've lost that democracy? Over here, you can't see it either. It says People's Entrance, closed, and it's locked. It's got a lock on it. So the people, you and I, we have no say in what goes on in the Senate. So that's why David Phillips is writing here that the Senate is the last thing in our government that decides prosperity or wealth. It either writes a law to help, or it refuses to write a law, or it writes a law against us, right? That's what he's talking about here. Just so you know how dangerous it is to be a muckraker, David Phillips will be gunned down in the streets of New York City. He'll be coming out of a restaurant with his wife, and an individual was well known. He was attached to politics as well, and there's a lot of conspiracy theory to this day about why this guy shot him. One of the things, David Phillips had exposed him for his corruption, but he might have also had some ties to some of these political bosses and these monopolists. And David Phillips will be gunned down in the streets of New York City. Yes, to be someone on the line to expose corruption can often be a very dangerous thing to do. This is why journalism is a very, very important aspect of our society, and really a safeguard for politics as well. I'm going to move on from that thought. Let's get back into Theodore. There's a young Theodore Roosevelt. Look at that. Bully! Delighted! delighted. Got a gun in my hand. So what were progressives trying to do? Well, progressives wanted federal legislation to get passed. So the federal government to pass laws. Both the House and the Senate to come together and pass laws to help. They want to regulate the economy, 1. They want to expand democracy, 2. They want to generate moral reform. And then you say dot, 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 because there's more, and we'll have that in the next slide. So both parties have progressive elements. There are Republicans who are very progressive at this time period. Not just Theodore, but there were others as well. The Democrats at first were not that progressive, but then with Woodrow Wilson coming, he will marry progressivism forever to the Democratic Party. They want to create, let's say, our direct primary elections. Something that we should be familiar of because we're getting ready to head into the primary season here very soon. And 2020 is an election year. For those of you who are watching this in the future, 2022, 2024, you have main elections, you have the midterm elections. So we have these primaries that take place for President of the United States especially, where you have various people in the both parties all want to run for president, but they go state to state, and the people vote who they want to nominate to run for president. Right? Up until now, in Theodore Roosevelt's day, it is the conventions that take place. You have a Democratic convention and a Republican convention that lasts a whole week, and the party decides, after voting on several different people, who they will eventually nominate. The people have no choice in this. So the progressives decide to give this back to the people. Let the people decide who should run for president or not. Now, that's going to take decades, by the way. It'll become decades before primary elections become an actual fixture of our election. In fact, not until 1980 does it become a full-on feature. And even then, it's confusing. So just know, it's really more of a modern thing for us, but it started here. This, again, helps to take away the power of political bosses. Political bosses just cannot handpick men anymore to be the President of the United States. They called for referendum and recall votes. A recall vote, pretty self-explanatory. Something is voted upon and gets passed, but the people didn't like it. So they want to recall that vote and vote again. You could recall the vote for governor of a state. For instance, you might have heard of an actor named Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was governor of California, or as he would say, California. He got there by a recall vote. There already was a governor, but people got angry over certain issues, and they had a recall vote, and they voted in the Terminator. It's not a tumor. That's a bad impersonation, and I apologize to everybody for that. You had to hear that. I'm sorry. But what's a referendum? Again, one of those things I want you to look up. Tell me what a referendum is and why that is important. So again, in letter B, ... progressive amendments come. Now I have Woodrow Wilson here in the background because these amendments actually come while he is President of the United States. And there's 4 of them. The 16th Amendment is the income tax. All of a sudden, it became, if you're going to have progressive agendas, the government's got to have money to pay for these, so they pass an income tax. When you get a job now, this guy, FICA, takes money out of our paycheck, and they start using it for various programs. By the way, what were the last 3 amendments that were passed? Awkward silence, right? Because some of you are thinking, what? Are we talking about amendments? I don't know. Some of you are back there raising your hand so fast. I see you, David. I know, your hand's up. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, right? Right after the Civil War, Reconstruction era. So that's the 1860s and early 1870s. Now we go all the way back to we go all the way forward, I should say, into the 19-teens before we get another series of amendments. It's not easy to change the Constitution. Well, the 17th Amendment is the one that finally tells us that the state will vote. People get to vote now for their state senator. So every time there's an election, every 2 years, 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election. So not the whole Senate. The whole House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years, and that's been since the beginning. But now, every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for election. All right, that is the 17th Amendment. Of course, the 18th is Prohibition, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the 1920s. And of course, the 19th Amendment, which we're coming up on the 100th anniversary, 1920 to 2020. 100 years of suffrage for women in America. But as we'll talk about as well, there are already a lot of women who could vote in America, right? Out in the western states, for instance, they could vote. But this amendment allowed for all of American women. Now, full citizenship, full protection under the law. The 14th Amendment, which gives us due process protection, that now fully is part of the experience for women in this country as well. Not just your voting rights, but also your citizenship and your due process protection will also come. We go to C, preservation and conservation. Now, they're two different things. A preservationist, that person doesn't want land, let's say the Grand Canyon here in the background, the Redwood Forest, Niagara Falls. Those things are preserved. They're never touched. Where the conservationist, that person wants to do the same thing, but they also understand that there is still progress. There's still things that have to be done. So if we're going to tear down a forest for lumber, we've got to plant another forest to regrow. Right? That's what a conservationist would do. That's what Theodore Roosevelt was. Theodore Roosevelt, and this is my opinion, and I'm sure people disagree with me, but he's our first truly environmentalist president. He began to see the natural wonders. He called the natural wonders of America the great cathedrals of America. A cathedral, a church, right? We go to the forest, we go to the mountains, we go to the great rivers to find spirituality, for instance. And he wanted to preserve them. The man next to him is the preservationist John Muir. If you've ever been to California and you've ever been to the Muir Redwood Forest, I've been to the Muir Forest. If you've never seen one of these sequoia trees, please, at some point in your life, you gotta go. And some of them are thousands of years old. And people wanted to dig them out of the ground and basically use them for lumber. And then Roosevelt helps to establish a national park system. We already had Yosemite Park, but he's going to expand Yosemite Park to start protecting natural resources. Conservation again versus preservation. We get the New Lands Act of 1902, 125 million acres of land set aside for Federal Reserve. And this will become debated in both Democratic and Republican circles for the next 100 years. At what point do you keep preserving them? At what point do you start opening them up for development? And it's a slippery slope. I'm not going down that one, but it is important to have protections for our natural resources. In our back door, we have the Everglades, right? We have laws that protect as much of the Everglades as we possibly can. Now I have this book up here, Fierce Discontent, The Rise and Fall of the Progressive Movement in America. A very popular book. This is a very important book, and a lot of the things I've talked about kind of come from there. And I know you're never going to go read the book, but oftentimes in our exam, you might find that there are excerpts of this book that will be used to help keep your mind focused on what progressivism was and how it's still with us in a lot of respects. So our final concept here, letter D, tells us the progressives were divided over many issues. They're not 100%, no group is 100% united on anything. Right? For instance, progressives, some supported Southern segregation, while others simply ignored its presence. Now I have down here, and this comes from this book, some of them saw segregation as a protection. They actually call it the shield of segregation. For some, they feel that this protected both black labor, it allowed black individuals to get jobs in segregated areas, and it could protect their voting rights. Many people can look back at this and say this was one of the failures. Remember one of our focus question, right? What seems very democratic about progressivism, what was very anti-democratic? Well, definitely a failure when it came to segregation. While there were those progressives who fought to try to end segregation, the majority of them either supported it or tried to ignore it. That is definitely an anti-democratic idea when it comes to progressivism. Some, again, advocated expanding of popular participation in our election. There's your, again, just to reinforce the primary elections, recall votes, referendums, which you got to look up for me. While others called for greater reliance on professional technical experts to make government more efficient. Efficiency becomes a very big deal, right, for progressives. One of the things we get in schools, for instance, is home economics comes at this time period. I don't know if you ever took home economics. I had to take that when I was in school. Boys and girls took it, right? Learning how to become more efficient at home. Making your own clothes, cooking your own meals, how to basically, even with the inventions of things like the vacuum cleaner, the dishwasher come at this time, progressives saw this as how to make keeping your home clean more efficient, right? They're all for the scientific management in that regard. Progressives also disagreed about immigration restriction. There were those like Jane Addams who embraced the idea of immigrants. We're going to come to find that there were also those who talked about limiting immigration. In the 1920s, we're going to get another series of laws that's going to try and restrict immigration. Our first laws, do you remember, anybody remember the first laws ever, long time ago? John Adams was president of the United States. No, not John Quincy, the first one, the dad. We had the XYZ affair going on, right? We had the Alien Acts, and they were alien, and there were also sedition acts. So there's been a lot of give and take over the years when it comes to immigration. The rise of nativism happens in the early 19th century. The Know Nothing Party. You got a restrictive law against the Chinese in the 1880s. And then by the 1920s, more restrictive laws about immigrants come, and some of the progressives supported that. But they were trying to create this homogeneous, or this very American, everybody is American kind of an idea. Now, is that democratic or anti-democratic? I mean, that's up to you to decide. Separate but equal, as we talked about before you went on break a little bit, we're going to do a little thing in class about the Plessy v. Ferguson case that comes. That's actually in period 6, but a lot of it is very, very important for not only period 7, but especially period 8. So Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, is going to stay with us for a long time. So here we're going to end our lesson here. And again, I hope to see everybody very, very soon. Have a good evening, good day, good morning, whatever it is for you as you're watching this. Bye-bye.